Hi, Meg and Santina, can you hear us? And can you please check your audio? Thank you.
I can hear you. Hi.
Thank you.
Secondary can meet, please.
Hi, can you hear us? And can you please check if your audio is working, your mute right now?
Is he frozen?
No, Eric, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Eric.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to get my audio working.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, it's working.
Me?
Man, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, right.
Perfect.
I'm missing Jessica.
Oh, and Vanessa is.
Oh, yes, it's there.
Okay.
But she should not have been.
Oh, okay, okay. Okay. Oh, so, how did we send out the Zoom link to the broader school?
You're actively driving, but is it in the invite?
It is in the invite and it is also on the school calendar, but if you,
Okay, I'll find it out.
if you give me your email, I can email it to you right now.
Yeah, it's J Vander, VANDERK @UMD.
Vander?
Vander with a G, yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay, yeah.
Are you ready, Shata? Finish the recording then. Very well. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for joining us for this very important conversation. All the more important now that these topics are vanished or banned. But we'll continue pressing on. And this is a series that we're offering here in the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and most particularly is an offering from the JEDI Collective. I'm the JEDI officer for the school, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion officer. Let's talk about those words as well with pride. And it is a series that is called Violence, Conflict, and Space, Peace Building Contributions from the Special Disciplines. So we want to talk about the problems, but we also want to talk about the contributions to peace buildings and how we can continue to cultivate hope in the midst of problems and great and growing challenges that we are facing in the country and in the world. Today's topic is climate change and disasters, trauma, reconstruction, planning and design, and we have a phenomenal series of speakers and a great moderator of our own. Before we get to them, let me speak very briefly about ground rules of respectful dialogue that we will all engage in very rapidly, just to remind everybody that we'll engage in constructive and open-minded participation, that will stay on topic, that will respect everyone's voices, that will maintain composure and respect, that we will also use the chat respectfully. We'll welcome your questions and comments on the chat. No hate speech or discrimination or any inappropriate content, and will follow the moderator's instructions. But I also have instructions for the moderators and for the speakers, and they have heard those before. And it's basically that the speakers will have 5 minutes for their introductory remarks, because the intent is not to dwell so much in their presentations, and they have, hours to go on with presentations given their expertise, but to dwell on dialogue. So after the introductory remarks, the moderator will guide a discussion, a conversation among them all, and then he will open it up for discussion with the rest of us. So I will hand it out to Marcos. Marcos, introduce yourself, introduce your speakers, and carry on.
Sure, thanks a lot, Clara. For those who don't know me, Marcus Hendricks, Associate Professor here in the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, really have labeled myself as one of a few environmental focused planners on staff here in the school. And my work squarely situated within sort of the broader spectrum of environmental planning to include aspects of climate and environmental justice. And so enough about me, really excited about our super awesome panel, super diverse in terms of experience, perspective, geography. And so first up on my list, we have Minkyu, which is a former colleague of ours here at the University of Maryland, who is dearly missed. But Ming is now an associate professor at the School of Architecture and the College of Engineering at the University of Notre Dame. She is also the Associate Dean for Research at the School of Architecture. Her expertise is as a building scientist and environmental engineer, and her work encompasses extensive practical and theoretical experience in decarbonizing the built environment, aiming to mitigate its environmental footprint and human health impacts. And specifically, she investigates the life cycle environmental impacts associated with building technologies and policies. And so welcome, Ming. Nice to have you. Nice to see you. Next up, we have Santina Contreras. Santina, also a longtime friend and colleague, who is an assistant professor of urban planning and spatial analysis in the Sol Price School of Public Policy at USC, not South Carolina, but Southern California. Her research focuses on examining the implementation, equitability, and underlying power dynamics associated with community engagement activities in hazard, disaster, and environmental planning spaces. Her work, she takes an interdisciplinary approach towards understanding relationships between local communities and external stakeholders to highlight the ways in which inequitable engagement approaches can lead to the overburdening and extraction of local communities. She's published in a number of outlets, and again, focused on equity, justice, and engagement, and really looking forward to hearing about what you've been up to, Santina. Welcome. Next up, we have Eric Bernstein. Eric is a doctoral student in the Urban and Regional Planning and Design program. He previously worked as a research associate in the Climate and Communities Practice area at the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Research Center at the Urban Institute, where he focused on evaluations of federal housing assistance and disaster resilience in urban and regional governance. He was previously a Peace Corps volunteer in the Republic of Moldova, and a Fulbright scholar in Romania. I added this, Eric, to your bio, but his current work involves acting as the lead graduate research assistant on a multi-year, multi-million-dollar interdisciplinary project between the School of Architecture and the College of Ag and Natural Resources on the possibilities of emerging ag tech and climate mitigation and crop adaptation to sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, with a specific focus on environmental justice and underserved farmers of color along the eastern shore of Maryland. Welcome, Eric. And last but certainly not least, Jesse, we hate that you couldn't join us in person, and Jesse so decorated, so much to be said about Jesse, and I had to just skim off the top in terms of what Jesse has done and who he is. But currently an associate professor of sustainable real estate and urban planning, and also the director of the Center on Climate Change and Urbanism at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. Jesse's research focuses on the intersection of climate change mitigation and adaptation in the built environment, including aspects of design, engineering, regulation, planning, and financing. Jesse has previously advised on matters concerning the built environment for federal agencies here in the U.S., governors, mayors, Fortune 500 companies, and a variety of tech and ventures and community enterprises. Let's see. Jesse is a certified planner with the American Institute of Certified Planners, a fellow of the Forum Plus Institute for Urban Design, and was previously a Pension Real Estate Association Scholar and Visiting Fellow at Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. And so, Jesse, welcome. Nice to have you. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jesse. And so following Clara's instructions to me and to you all, just to open us up, can each of you provide just a brief introduction to your work and how and where it's situated in the context of climate and disasters? And also, you know, to Clara's point, not only focusing on the looming peril, but also the possibilities. And so maybe we'll start with Ming.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Really good to see you all and see some familiar faces and also new students. Just so you know, my background is still Maryland, TLTC building background here. So I missed you all dearly. As Marcus introduced, my focus, I'm building scientist, engineer, and architect. I'm very comfortable and intentionally want to sit in between, in the intersection of everything. In terms of how my work relate to climate change, in general is I study how built environment impact on climate change and also human health in general. I mainly focus on creating large database, methodology, and a framework to measure, mapping, and predict the potential of climate change, exacerbated environmental impact and human health impact. For example, currently, for the past couple of years, I have been focusing on the extreme temperature related induced human health outcome. And it is a variety of health outcome, not only just the heat stroke and the heat, especially temperature related things, but also the extreme weather can have direct pathway and impact on even on the chronic disease. So those are the things I have been focusing on in past couple years. And in terms of the scale, I work on both scale, like smaller scale on individual building, retrofitting, and the new construction, and also work on big scale. For example, the entire city, entire Baltimore, Chicago. The goal is mapping out, create a database for all future researchers, policymakers, and even public to use, so they can take those database and do all kinds of analysis.
Sure, thanks so much, man. Santina.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to Clara for the invitation. Thanks, Marcus, for moderating. Excited to get to participate in this panel. So just to give a little bit about background on my work. So I, as was mentioned, I do really a lot of research centering on thinking about community engagement questions around hazards and disasters. I've been doing this in one form or another for quite a while now. I started as an engineer, so listening to your description of what you're doing in the built environment was really exciting. I used to do a lot as a structural engineer, specifically thinking about housing reconstruction around earthquakes. And so in my work as an engineer, it was really impactful, but a lot of what I learned was a lot of the gaps that would come up in terms of thinking about recovery questions in terms of how we weren't working with communities in an equitable way. So that's really what pulled me to the social sciences and sort of think more deeply about that specifically as a planner. And so now I really do that same kind of a work, but thinking about it in this interdisciplinary space of thinking about what's really happening when we're doing community engagement. And so, you know, for a lot of us, it's not something that's unfamiliar. We all kind of know that we should be engaging with people. You know, some participation is always something that's kind of inherently talked about as a positive thing. But a lot of what my work looks like is trying to ask some really specific questions about what's actually involved in those activities. How are we really working with communities? Are we doing that in ways that's really actually empowering them, or are we doing that just to sort of fulfill overarching objectives that we have to meet for our funders and our universities? And so trying to think deeply about what that looks like to actually build up communities in that way. And so while I started thinking about this really as sort of a disaster planner, the nature of humans and problems has really taken me in a lot of different spaces. And more specifically, it's taking me to sort of broader environmental worlds. And so it's kind of why it's exciting here to talk about these intersections between climate and disasters and all of that, because that's really, I've been sort of drawn to think about more broad environmental questions purely because that's where my communities have taken me. And so now not only do I sort of think about these questions in terms of like how they happen, you know, before and after disasters, but really just in terms of how it happens in terms of different sort of environmental issues and planning projects. And so I have a couple other ongoing projects in the LA area, thinking about things outside of just disaster specific, but other sorts of resilience concerns. So what does it look like to think about urban forestry in terms of building resilience for local communities? What does infrastructure justice look like in terms of meeting the needs of the ways that different partners and stakeholders need? And so in terms of methodology, I do mixed method work, but the majority of my work tends to be very qualitative. I do a lot of interviews and focus groups and different sorts of tools, photo voice, things to really sort of try to find ways to give communities a voice in research and sort of reporting and academic publications. And so I'm excited to sort of talk about what that looks like and compared to other people's work and experiences. So thanks for having me.
Sure, thanks a lot, Santina. And Eric, your ears should be buzzing with everything that Santina mentioned. You want to jump in and share the context of your work?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Just very briefly, Santina, I'm actually going to be in LA next week.
Come
If
on
you have
down.
any suggestions,
You know, you have a friend.
check out. Yeah, you know, as Dr. Hendricks mentioned, I was working as a research associate at the Urban Institute, doing a lot of work on disaster resilience and frameworks around resilience policy implementation prior to coming back to school. And I've been struggling a bit with these ideas as I've been thinking about how to implement the project that I'm working on with Dr. Hendricks right now around engaging communities in the Eastern Shore, and especially engaging disparate communities across a broader region. You know, the Eastern Shore is a very different landscape than I think a lot of us are used to working in. It's rural. There are, you know, urban centers, but especially when we're talking about the infrastructure of waste management and the movement of inputs to that process and waste products, some of which are also commodities, around that region, and who is exposed, who has opportunities, who has liabilities because of that, is a really important piece, and how you get people across a broad region like that engaged. I think that there's something else that you mentioned that I think is really interesting, that this question of what is the value of engagement, This is also something I know there was some discussion of not dwelling on the current political climate, but this is something I've been very much thinking of in the context of a space right now where pluralism, which is kind of the basis for a lot of the way that we do engagement, is under attack. If not something that's kind of been shown to be a bit of a, a mirage at times. And wanting to also respect that people, especially in these communities, have a lot of other responsibilities and priorities, and that the people who have been excluded from processes, we don't necessarily want to be asking them to take on the burden of including themselves when other people haven't had to take on that burden. So I think like balancing these questions and figuring out what systems look like to empower and engage without having to place extra burden on already burdened communities. And to critically assess these ideas of participation and what are the actual values and goals behind them, rather than just, participation as an end to itself because pluralism is good in planning. So I'm really excited to hear more about what you're doing, especially as we're thinking about, identifying the communities that we want to engage, identify the communities that could potentially have a stake in these new technologies that we're working with, et cetera. I'll leave it there.
Oh, thanks a lot, Eric. That's super helpful. Jesse.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm very sorry that I couldn't be there at the last minute. I was going to be one of the highlights of my month was the opportunity to visit you all and really see Clara, who's absolutely one of my favorite people, and meet Marcus and the whole thing. So I'm very sorry, and hopefully I'll get to visit at some point in time. My body of work is in adaptation science and the built environment, and I would think about this covering multiple scales. And you could start conceptually thinking at a household level. And at a household level, my work has looked at how people make decisions, how perceptions and physical exposure are differentiated, and how we take our understanding of risk and as opportunity as well, and make decisions in terms of, as we may infer through sorting or other consumption-based patterns that we can understand, for instance, through housing. I've also worked and have done work on a broader realm associated with climate-driven human mobility. And we can think about that in changing consumer preferences. We can think about this in just actual migration or climate migration or even localized relocation. What are those forces of push and pull, for instance, both climatic and non-climatic, that shape these types of associated behaviors? Done a lot of work in public sector as well, and I thank you for not referencing my other job with the federal government, and of which I'm speaking my private capacity today. But I've done a lot of work. I think I would sort of reference this in the context of sort of multi-objective policies, right? That we have a lot of ambitions that are non-climactic in orientation, and how do we think about how climate change influences that? And I've done a lot of work on that in infrastructure, in systematic orientation to risk, finance, national security, and a lot of different realms. I've also, by extension, in that sort of line of work, done a fair amount of work in the private sector, or in the context of the private sector, and we could think about that through sort of market-based mechanisms for adaptation, good and bad, and evaluation in those terms, but also thinking about how the market itself is adapting and how that may be, for instance, maladaptive to consumers or individuals or communities or whatever that may be, and that friction that's set up, particularly in the market economies of housing, mortgages, financial services, insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, I've been very interested both at a pedagogical level, but also in a primary area of research in terms of how designers, architects, engineers, and planners, professionals in the built environment, public health professionals, and others, how do they do their jobs? How do they translate science, this in climate science in particular, integrated impact models and various applications, multiscalar applications of climate science and the associated models? How do they handle uncertainty? How do they handle deep uncertainty and their own ignorance in the execution of a certain ethic, as one may argue, for the advance of thinking about what comes next in the future? And I think that plays out in a lot of different fundamental ways that I hope we can talk about today. One of which is that in the broader realm of adaptation science, and we discursively, in terms of a public discourse, talk about resilience and hazard mitigation and a whole umbrella of concepts that fall within adaptation science. And this, by the way, has been a struggle at the IPCC and elsewhere. This is something that's not fully, I'd say, from which there's a consensus that drives our public conversations on this front, but a challenge to this idea that certain actions are by default objectively equitable, or that resilience by default creates some kind of universal positive outcome. And so what I've been trying to push people towards for many years now, and which I hope we can talk about a little bit today, are the inherent trade-offs in climate interventions and the extent to which any intervention that we make that may have uneven distributional or even procedural orientations in terms of justice and recognitional justice, whatever these mechanisms or frames of analysis are, I think we misinterpret and under-evaluate the extent to which there's a maldistribution, at least in some context, of resources themselves, or even trade-offs between human and environmental welfare that go unrecognized, that have long-term implications ultimately for human welfare in reciprocal terms. So anyway, I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but I sent a prompt to the committee that I hope that we get in a little bit of trouble today and we challenge some assumptions, because I think it's a healthy time, and now's the time to do that and reflect on what we've done to date in the advance of American climate policy and planning, because there's so much ahead of us. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Jesse, and really important comments, especially towards the tail end of your opening remarks. And I might add that a large portion of the in-person participants are actually from my graduate seminar on sustainability. And last week we were thinking about the environmental justice and equity aspects of sustainable development, and sort of begging this question: does sustainability equal justice? Does resilience inherently equal justice? And we know that it doesn't. And so really hoping that, each of you can chime in and really drive that home in the ways in which injustice rears its ugly head and is inherently actually baked in terms of disparity across these cycles and processes that each of you are involved in. And so Jesse and me, you both talked about sort of structures and housing. And we know that, right now, the real estate market is in flux. Housing, scarcity, is a real issue. Santina, we know that, Southern California folks impacted by the fires are currently rebuilding. And so could you, each of you, and Jesse and me specifically, but Santina and Eric, feel free to chime in. Give us what is the latest and greatest in terms of housing, in terms of opportunities to reduce emissions, to adapt to climate disasters, and maybe provide some specific examples from your work. Jesse or Ming, feel free to go first.
I'll jump in, and maybe I'll hang, and I'll try to be brief in the interest of hearing from others. But one thing that jumps out is, and I'm going to use your prompt on, like, what's the good news, right? Where do we start to see the manifestation of investments that we've made playing out in ways that we didn't necessarily anticipate? And so, one of the challenges I think that we have in the idea of decarbonizing and de-risking the built environment in general, whether it's housing or infrastructure or whatever it may be, is who really pays for that? Right? And you can think about it in broader terms, distributional terms associated with the tax base, or ultimately the split incentives between renters and landlords, right? There's a huge range of cohorts operating at different scales about who really pays for these costs. And certainly in terms of decarbonization, well, really on both dimensions, there are significant costs that are often sort of, one could argue, inequitably distributed. And that becomes a burden, right? And in fact, it can even become a significant cost burden formally, and we see research associated with that. But I'll just shift quickly to a positive note, which is the other day I was reading some research on the PACE program and the extent to which we see a kind of subordinated financing mechanism help people pay for retrofits in their homes, right? It's kind of debatable about what those outcomes really are at the end of the day, but generally viewed as a positive mechanism, both in a commercial and a residential context, for helping people put up the upfront capital investments necessary for retrofits. Maybe not deep retrofits as a formal matter, and I'll turn it over to others to talk about that, but weatherization and things that really matter. And there's research that came out, and this is a working paper, economics working paper, so take it with a grain of salt. But what they were really showing was that people who participated in this program actually had lower mortgage delinquency rates and default rates. And there's a couple sort of confounding variables that may explain that. You can think about participants and their underlying income distribution being one of them. But when they controlled for that, what they really found is, I think intuitively what we understand, is that when you make these investments, it reduces the underlying cost burden, right? Investments in energy efficiency and decarbonization have the collateral effect of, in many cases, of reducing that carrying cost or that underlying cost burden that already exists. That's literally more cash in people's pockets, and they're more likely, for whatever reason, to pay or not be delinquent on the mortgage. So this has collateral widespread implications in the accumulation of wealth for people, right? And that's an argument we intuitively have known or made arguments for, but one from which there has been, I would say, an emergent empirical basis. So anyway, small bit of good news, and I'll turn it over to others.
Me? Thanks, Jesse.
Yeah, I think I will continue the good news that Jesse just laid out. Because of course, in the housing market itself is really complicated, right? We can talk, there could be the one whole day symposium, but I do want to piggyback to what Jesse mentioned about retrofits and the sustainability, affordability. Because this, my core, if I see there's one umbrella core research focus of mine is decarbonizing built environment. And in developed country like the United States, the retrofitting is the priority. We just, in terms of new construction rate, it's very, very low. Majority of the building and project our students will be working on will be retrofitting, no matter it's a housing or commercial building. So that, and very naturally, that has been my focus for the past several years as well. The first thing I want to mention is sustainability. There is a perception, at least there is a common perception in United States, sustainable building, it's inherently expensive and not affordable to most people. But this is really a misperception. In my third book, I did get the actual construction cost of 175 LEED building owned by GSA, the actual construction cost, and did analysis and did quite a lot of empirical analysis. It turns out actually LEED buildings, if designed right and constructed right, actually could be lower, could cost lower than non-LEED conventional buildings. So again, this is just a perception people have about the non-affordability of sustainable building. The question is why people have the perception. So I think in general, in United States, sustainability and especially probably the LEED, the branding of the LEED has been used as a market brand, a market pull, rather than actually focusing on making the building more sustainable, environmental friendly, and affordable. So that is a completely different approach when we talk about sustainable building. For me, the real sustainable building actually should be a good building, right? What does the good building mean? Good building meaning design right, construct right, and also affordable to everyone. So I think first thing I really want to debunk is sustainable building is a more expensive building. It does not need to be. We have empirical evidence proof that. The second thing is a retrofitting, right? If we understand the sustainable building in general does not need to be more expensive, then retrofitting does not need to be expensive as well. So I have been working with actually focusing on two stakeholder group or user group. One is Section 8, Section 8 renters, and the other is the low-income energy affordability program participants. So those are all low-income. So that is my basically the stakeholder group I have been working with, and we are also working with department developer to try to find out really low cost retrofitting strategies. Then can retrofit the building to become the housing, particularly to become more energy efficient and also healthy for the residents. Because there is clear evidence, empirical evidence, including our study, to show the energy burden is one of the most prominent correlation or indicator to mental health. That is very clear, and regardless what kind of climate zone you are in. What is the low cost retrofitting techniques? Actually, we all know that it's based on passive design. So those are the things I am very how should I say, very positive that we can make that work, because from big data, which we know the empirical evidence, and also from the hands-on testing, we can really validate and verify those low-cost solution can work for the retrofitting, especially energy retrofitting. So I will just leave there.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Ming. And, Santine, I saw you unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I mean, I don't want to ruin the mood. I super appreciate that Jesse and Ming are bringing up all the positive things. So I apologize for being like the Debbie Downer in this situation, because dispatches from LA, it's not looking great. We were asking about housing and structures. I'm sure everyone's aware of the situation that we're in right now. We're kind of like we're in the really early stages of the recovery. I mean, if you can even call that, we're really in a transitionary phase right now from the impacts of the January wildfires. And so I just wanted to add to this, because I think I really appreciate sort of hearing sort of these nuggets of optimism in terms of things that we can sort of grab onto in terms of thinking about some of these ways that things are maybe presented in certain ways that are more expensive and actually have more feasibility than we might automatically think. I think what we're experiencing from like the disaster standpoint is that, I've been asked to speak at a lot of, like across the board in terms of like, what does it look like, asking perspectives on building LA back better. That's, obviously after disasters, that's always a theme that comes up. And so it's been no different the past 3 months. And one of the first questions people always ask me is a lot of what Ming was describing. What does it look like to actually, can we build back more resiliently? Specifically, a lot of our conversations are having to do with, in addition to some of the things that Ming brought up from sort of a what does it look like to make our buildings more, LEED sustainable or passive, but also in terms of resilient to potential future disasters. And so for us, it's what does it mean to sort of use materials and think about things that would be potentially more resistant to future wildfires. And so that's always a conversation that is very prominent. So I guess, a little bit of good news is I think it's been really exciting to see how many people are interested in having that conversation. There's a lot of neighborhoods that are actually really actively thinking about that and seeking out design professionals that can provide those services so that we can actually be, implementing them. But the reality, and I speak from, the spaces that I work in, which tends to be the more vulnerable populations, we're already seeing that the recovery and resilience is not happening in an equitable way, right? Not all of the communities across LA are able to sort of think actively about those options as we would want. And so specifically, I'm working with communities in Altadena, which is a historically Black neighborhood. And so, we're trying to get to the place where we can even think about what does it mean for these families to be able to stay in these spaces and actually not be relocated, displaced from, what has been their home for generations. And so while it is promising that we're having the conversation, there are a lot of spaces where we can't even really get to the point where we're even thinking about the sustainable materials. And so I just wanted to add to the conversation that I think another piece of this, of thinking about even from housing and structures, like what does it mean for me when I'm thinking about what does it mean to like build resiliently, like who's going to be in those homes, right? And so if they're built more sustainably and they're super green, but they're not the people that were living there before, and those people don't have access to the places, I would argue that that's not necessarily that resilient, right? Or we weren't able to sustain that community is a problem. And so that's part of the conversations that we're having, is how do we implement some of these really great ideas that we're hearing alongside ways that can sort of overcome the other sorts of burdens in places like LA that are very expensive. We were already in the middle of an affordable housing crisis to begin with. And so that kind of adds to the dimensions of why it can be difficult to sort of think sustainably. So not to make it, a negative thing. It's just more additional things for us to think about collectively. And I also like really hope that my fellow panelists can help me think in a more hopeful way, because as the disaster planner, I tend to be, Marcus knows this, that we kind of tend to live in the
Dystopia.
yeah, not the bad, but like, it's the reality of the spaces that we live in. So
Yeah, no, Santina, thank you and for jumping in. And really that was sort of along the lines of my next question to you and Eric, in terms of like, how do we, if we need to, how do we market sort of, more sustainable LEED certified buildings, more adapted structures to communities if in fact we need to. But also more importantly, how do we meet communities where they are? How do we support them from an affordability, feasibility perspective? And maybe Eric, you can jump in here and just say, what has been your experience and what is your approach to engagement to ensure some of the things that Santina has already started to touch on?
Yeah. So I think that one thing that's really important to think about, and I'm actually curious, Jesse and Mingyu, if you can speak to this at all a little later, is when we're talking about the affordability and we're talking about the costs associated with retrofits and resilience building, how much of the real estate market itself and the geography of exposure is built into that? Our individual retrofits are great, but we know, as we've already discussed here, Mingyu, that LEED certified, for example, becomes a commodity rather than a feature of a building very often, and ends up having a market value associated with it as a like green commodity. The same thing happens with a lot of spaces that go through environmental improvements in general. And there's been a significant, portion of the literature around called green gentrification or climate gentrification that has to do with this idea that things that are maybe seen as environmental improvements can actually be harmful for people living in communities who can no longer live in those spaces and end up in places that potentially are actually worse in terms of exposure, in terms of these other pieces. So, it's I always find it hard to understand when we're talking about a reduction in cost or affordability. Are we just talking about the building, or are we talking about the implication for the land value, for the value of the property, for taxes that go into that, which could either directly, for homeowners be a problem, or indirectly for renters, increase their rental burden. In terms of engagement, I mean, I wish I had a more direct solution. I think that, Santina, I don't want to speak for you, but I'm guessing that what you're finding is that, it always is what's on the ground at that moment. It's hard to create any kind of general rules of what that looks like, but it has to do with these sort of rules of thumb of, following as much as you're leading, moving at the speed of trust, and, making sure that you're working within the community's priorities rather than trying to impose what you believe are the key issues onto the community itself.
I was gonna say thanks for that, Eric. I can just speak to that second part. Yeah, it's definitely been interesting watching this unfold. You know, I guess I'll say it's interesting. You know, I've been doing this work in some way or form for, you know, a really long time. I've seen like lots of different disasters. Like I feel like I kind of know the playbook pretty well. It still has been fascinating to watch it unfold like in my own neighborhood, you know, in my community. Uh, I think I think I wasn't prepared for how that was going to hit a little bit differently, especially when you kind of know, as you said, like there's this playbook that happens. And so, yes, I would agree that it's kind of happening how you would expect in terms of a lot of I mean, you didn't say this. I think you were saying it in a much kinder way, but I think a lot of lip service, I would say, to engagement. And so what you see very frequently happening right now is um, questions maybe are rising up in terms of if everyone who is impacted is really getting the right seat at the table to have their voices sort of heard in the recovery process. And again, I specifically say that in terms of thinking about we have a unique case happening right now where there was two communities that had a wildfire effects. And so Pacific Palisades has a very different demographic from Altadena. And so a lot of the meetings that I sit at, you know, one of the first questions I ask is, you know, or look for is that there isn't as much representation of Altadena as there is Pacific Palisades, which is the area that is much more underserved. And so I think that's what some of these questions look like as you're talking about like the engagement piece is, I think we want to sort of the pushback, I'm sure you get this too, Eric, all the time I get is that we don't have time for that right now, right? Like we, you know, it's people are in a rush. We need to get back to homes. You know, this is always the common refrain around engagement, around disasters. And so that's going to slow down the process. And so that's usually kind of used as a sort of conversation to um, allow for things to kind of move forward and sort of we'll think about that later. And that usually tends to be very problematic. And so we're in that place right now where, you know, obviously I don't want to sort of speak for what's going to happen in the future, but that's why it can be concerning. And then just to your other point about the affordability piece of it, there are sort of grants and different sorts of programs that have been sort of set up to try to allow people to get access to some of these ideas that we're talking about here today. And so you can, I think specifically some of the green building councils have some grants where, you know, if you put in some version of sustainable reconstruction, you'll get a certain additional sort of funding, that sort of stuff. So we do have some programs that are sort of set up to try to encourage that. But again, I think when you're trying to overcome speculators, things that are being, you know, thrown around in some of these recovery meetings I'm at are sort of like, should a developer just come and buy all of Altadena and just, you know, make it a completely new planned area? That would be cheaper. And we could do them all resiliently, quickly. But then there's no engagement, there's no voice. You know, I'm asking who have you talked to people? Do they want this? So I think that's a lot of what this balance is looking like is making sure that we don't do speed and green and sustainable at the cost of some of these other things. And they really shouldn't be at odds, but unfortunately that's sometimes or pretty often what you can see. And so I'd love to hear what Ming and Jesse have seen in their spaces, because I think ours is kind of colliding with those two things at the same time right now.
Yeah, I'll just
Really quickly, Jesse, just to be clear about something that Santina was saying, Altadena, Santina, is a historically Black community, right?
Yeah.
And just last week, my class, we were using Seneca Village as an example in New York City, right? You know, Olmsted as a landscape architecture, allowing this open space in urban places more sustainable, but at the cost or expense of displacing a historic Black community. There was also, we had a guest lecturer that had a case study in China, right, where migrants were displaced in the spirit of resilience and sustainability. And so, again, whether we're talking individual communities, entire populations of people have been living at the push and pull of powerful entities and people who do have a seat at the table. And so we always have to keep our fingers on the pulse of sort of those injustices and inequities. Jesse.
No, it's a good point. And, you know, I just want to quickly respond to both Santina and Eric and their underlying prompts as well. And Santina's prompt about the uneven nature of the recovery, and the question that's asked deeply in empirical and conceptual terms is resilience for whom? And I think it begs, well, I think it imposes upon us of students and scholars and practitioners in this area to recognize there's really no such thing as resilience. Actually, the field of epistemological resilience is quite varied. And on some level, as Santina certainly knows in the seismic context, we have engineering resilience, which is a single equilibrium phenomenon. We have other aspects that are applied in policy and in planning, including ecological resilience and community resilience. And among other things, community resilience itself is a multi-equilibrium phenomenon, and it's largely normative. It's largely driven around indicators heavily focused to date in public health in particular. That its question is, what do we want that community to be, right? And removing the kind of determinism of that question. But that's quite distinct from engineering resilience. So I think we have to separate these things because it helps us understand the consequences of our actions. And I think when we conflate this language or use it in somewhat undisciplined terms, it gets in our way. To Eric's question about LEED, and he referenced it in terms of commodification, I would frame it more immediately in amenitization. Does LEED become just an amenity, right? And there's actually pretty limited evidence on this. But I would say evidence to the extent that the value of LEED becomes internalized into the property or capitalized in the market values. It's really a mixed bag on that front, but I would argue LEED's actually not the solution because I think Eric really and Ming I think set this up for us that LEED is it is a market instrument in a way, but really it is diluted in a lot of the association of elections that you make to sort of optimize a total points, right? It's a gain function that helps us certify on some level our intent, but doesn't necessarily relate ultimately to a higher level of performance. And in fact, you look at the standard deviation or the distribution of EUI or some measure of performance with LEED, at least not platinum, but at least in other aspects, it's pretty wide, actually. Energy Star generally performs much better across the board. So anyway, I would argue LEED's not really the answer. We need to be certainly more focused, and I'll turn it over to experts here. The other question is about risk capitalization in the marketplace and the extent to which resilience itself becomes capitalized into market values. Again, it depends, obviously, like everything in an academic or scholarly context or research context, but specific into California in a post-fire context, the observations are pretty clear. What tends to happen is that people come in and they build at a kind of co-plus standard, and they tend to build at a higher the properties tend to be underbuilt relative to their FAR or their allowable zoning code. And so what happens is people come in, they build to a higher intensity, and they build to a kind of co-plus standard, and that drives a higher property value ultimately, right? Even if they're just using their own proceeds or mortgage or personal, insurance proceeds or personal wealth to rebuild, it actually ends up having this sort of unintended consequence of driving up values and then, of course, driving rent seeking and the associated lack of typological housing diversity necessary to accommodate a lot of people. So it has these tremendous spillover effects. So at the end of the day, it ends up concentrating that wealth and that expenditure of capital and fundamentally changing not only the typology of the housing stock itself, but ultimately the wealth. So the resilience function in terms of the underlying engineering resilience, I should be precise, ends up being maladaptive, certainly in a community resilience context, because it is driving up property values and not necessarily with the intent of speculative intent. But of course, that does happen and is widely observed along the way. And finally, to Marcus's point about, and I wouldn't necessarily say in universal terms that green gentrification and landscape is always causal to the associated rent burdens or valuations that lead to displacement and things like that. There's actually pretty mixed evidence on that. But what I would say in the context of California is that Los Angeles Times just ran a really good piece on this. I think a lot of people from a technical point of view recognize that from a landscape, urban design, and architectural point of view, there are tools and techniques that we have, particularly in the context of buffers, right? And buffer zones, but also building at actually higher intensities, as the LA Times argues, or among the experts within this LA Times article that just came out. And I think it's all right. It all feels, from a technical point of view, correct. But there's a land trade-off, right? And that trade-off in terms of land scarcity and the underlying urban economic impacts or land economic impacts mean that, yeah, we create buffer zones, we shift that density somewhere along the way, but it doesn't mean that everybody's going along with the ride, right? And that can lead to measures of displacement that completely not only erode a community, but in the context of, let's say, Maui is a really good immediate example, can be just totally devastating and fundamentally reshape the culture and the composition of the community itself. So I'll stop there.
Sure, no, thanks, Jesse. And Ming, I see you unmuting and feel free to sort of jump into sort of my
Sure.
next question in terms of what is our role as planners, professionals in the built environment to facilitate sort of justice, to facilitate hope, to facilitate the management of trauma, displacement, repetitive losses, recovery. What is our role and how can we contribute?
Sure. Yeah. I do want to respond to what Jesse mentioned, which I completely agree. The lead is, for me, lead is not the solution for a variety of reasons. And there are empirical evidence, including ours. We did study all the lead building in New York City, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. compared to non-lead. Actually, lead building consume more energy. So there's a lot of social science reason behind that. And also the lead, if we treat the lead as a single solution, that can lead to green gentrification. But now respond to what Marcus just asked, what is our role? I want to see this. I understand Satina and Eric was talking about the displacement and all those uneven distribution of resources especially after the disasters happened. I think my main area of work is focusing on before disaster happened, to use tools and techniques to buffer those natural disaster, and also to help to not prevent but mitigate the level and the scale of impact. That goes back to we do retrofit, we fix our existing infrastructure, including housing, to make it more resilient to no matter it's engineering resilient or community resilience. But my part is focused on engineering resilience. And the role, again, it depends on what type of academia or research you are working on right now. Most of my work, I want to say it's applied and almost immediate applied. So I always work with community collaborator, actually is end user of my project. Those are low-income family. And in the area I'm in right now, it's just, I have been focused on low-income family. In the area I'm in right now, actually it is a Black community. And if I really focus on this group of population, low-income family, and I follow them to fix the infrastructure and retrofit the housing, then I think there is a direct pathway we can play. The direct role we can play as a researcher, utilizing our research result to really see some outcome, direct outcome. And probably it's just 1 year, probably it's a 5 year. At least we know the findings we have found from the research and it can be translated to some actionable activities in near future. So I think this is the role I will encourage all the young researchers or students to think about.
Thanks, man. Santina, Eric, any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I was can just add to I really like what Ming described. I was going to say, I think one of the things that I love so much about planning is that there's so many different ways that we can sort of like offer our expertise and sort of connect. And I think if done appropriately, can advocate for equity and justice related themes from like a variety of vantage points. And so, you know, maybe it's the engineering side and the more technical. For me, it's obviously connected to sort of like the community piece. And so the way that this works in my work is I really see what I do as an academic as sort of being kind of a conduit for community needs and interests. And so what I see pretty frequently is sort of a dismissiveness of sort of what communities want or what they're thinking, because maybe they haven't had the training to sort of speak their interests in sort of the academic speak. And so it kind of oftentimes can kind of get discredited or not sort of pulled in at the same value as sort of like hard science and analytical data can. And so a lot of, maybe like the majority of my projects these days really are just projects that some community group or partnership kind of brings to me. And they kind of say, this is the issue that is, of most importance to us. We want rigorous research done to be able to advocate for this or to show this. And I kind of do it for them. And it's kind of created some really nice partnerships because I'm able to sort of train them and they kind of almost become some version of, researchers and we sort of do this together. And so for me, that's how I always know that it's grounded in sort of like rooted in what communities want because they're telling me what to do. This leads to different, issues in terms of that's not necessarily how academia is structured. And as I mentioned in the beginning, maybe I wanted to just do disaster projects, but that's not always what communities are the most interested in, right? And so that's why in some moments I become a, urban forestry, trees person, because that's the concern that they're the most interested in resilience is things associated with that. And so it does, and I loved, that's kind of probably another conversation that's, if the young scholars in the room aren't having, that these are things that are inherent sometimes in really advocating for your community, that you have to kind of work through in terms of what that's going to look like for your scholarship and your career. But that's my version of it. And I think the other thing I always point out is that I don't think that has to be everyone's version, but I think we can all kind of take a piece of the pie if we all have that sort of larger goal of trying to do equitable work and sort of push justice, true justice. I think that, there's ways that we can see that in, justice in your AI research, justice in your, super quant method. And for me, it just happens to be more connected to sort of like community interests and advocacy on the ground.
No, that's great. Thanks, Santina. Eric, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm coming from a little bit more distance of a perspective as somebody who's been more in like policy space. But I definitely, I think I'm right in line with what you've been saying, Santina, in terms of my view of planners and planning researchers both is the best position we can put ourselves in is as translators and facilitators, translating in both directions. So translating technical data into forms that are usable and empowering for people who haven't had access or time or interest in gaining the skills to be able to leverage them themselves. And on the other side, translating the deep knowledge that people have from, I hate the term lived experience because I feel like it actually undervalues it, but rather thinking about like the deep knowledge of the local that people have, the deep knowledge of the networks, the deep knowledge of the ripple effects of things and the details of causation that we don't get to see in our data. Back to policymakers, back to analysts, and also making sure to not interpret these things as inputs to data, but as data themselves. That I think that there's a lot of discussion. This might be just me being in my little like PhD, working on a PhD world, but of like, using the data that you get to uncover some hidden thing. But when you're talking about wanting to translate and advocate, the information that you're getting from people who are sharing that with you about their communities, about their priorities, that's the data itself. That's the finding itself. It's not, unpacking it to see what their cognitive structures are underneath this or anything like that, but instead saying These are experts in their experience. And as such, we should use these as data coming from experts, and not try to second guess it with our interpretations. Obviously, we all have our interpretive filters and things like that, and we have our training and skill set, but not undermining it or not trying to explain it through our understanding of a positionality or something along those lines. The other thing that I'm just going to kind of shoehorn in here, because I think it's something I've been thinking about, in terms of burden, coming back to that of engagement, is obviously we're a long way from being able to do this in any kind of policy context in the States. But one way to think about engaging communities is to pay them. If we are thinking about them as experts, if we're thinking about their input as part of the political process, as citizen planners, then they are doing a professional service. And one way we can get them to be consistently involved and engaged is to pay them for their labor in this. And it is labor. We know this because we do it professionally. So, I think that if we value that in a capitalist structure, obviously, this should be a long process to be able to build out a political consensus to be able to do this. But I'm throwing this out for people who are young now and looking to get into the field in the long run. Incentives are fine, but maybe thinking about these people as, in a sense, consultants, thinking about these people as, having a value add that has monetary value. And in the world that we live in, that would in a way make them equals in a way that they don't as just participants.
No, that's great, Eric. Super appreciate everything that everyone has said. I think, Jesse, unless you want to add something now, but this is a good point to open it up to the audience for questions and folks online and in the room.
I think while people in the room are gathering their thoughts, I'll say this briefly. Santana said something very interesting. She said and I hope I'm recollecting this correctly, a true justice or something like that. And I know what she means, and something that we can observe and from which there's some, let's say, arguably some consensus that that's a just outcome or a just process, at least, or something. But then I struggle with the idea of justice, and certainly in the role of planners as facilitators with our own sort of biases and our own roles that we play in different ways. And if we're just this conduit for this flow of information, and that's fine, what happens when we're engaged in what we think to be unjust situations? Well, it triggers this kind of ethical framework and ethical response on some level. But then I struggle, I think, regularly with the idea of justice itself and our capacity to adjudicate what is just and unjust. And I think in many cases, obviously, it's patently unjust. So we've defined justice by the nature in the negative as a kind of, it's the opposite of injustice. But I struggle in more positivist terms to conceptualize justice in all the different forms, right? And I don't want to take us down that road. But, is it a consensus? Is it viewed through the eyes of democratic processes? Well, there's many consensus-based outcomes in planning that are feel good to some people. They may be adaptive to some, but are quite maladaptive to others, right? Particularly in the context of climate change, in the sense that drives a kind of measure of injustice in distributional terms. So is it really utilitarianism and like a maximize wealth, maximize happiness, maximize benefit? And we can adjust that in distributional terms to account for historical inequities? Or is there a different moral foundation of justice that acknowledges the subjectivities and also the ontological diversity of the people who are participating, whose idea of justice may be in complementary or may be directly in conflict with each other? And frankly, I struggle with that.
Yeah,
Can
Jeff, Oh, Santina, go ahead. I was just gonna say quickly, Santina, that I was having a conversation about a year and a half ago with the former director of NOAA, and we were sitting on a panel together about this very topic. And I said, you know, it's funny that we know how to do injustice really well, and we've been consistent in that regard, but we struggle just with conceptualizing, you know, the idea of the opposite, which is justice.
Yeah, yeah, that I would and I would endorse that statement 100%. And I would also just add, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe like a quick response to some of what Jesse said. I think it's both. I think it's both. I think we have a moral obligation to do, to be doing justice related work, but I also think there's a lot of really pragmatic pieces. And I think that I know for some reason it gets into this like touchy-feely, too open-ended space sometimes that I think a lot of people feel like it, to Marcus's point, I think there's like one version of it that is not as difficult to process, but there are others that are. And just to give a little bit of tidbit of an example, I think people are uncomfortable thinking about injustices in our processes, which is a lot of what I talk about in my work. So it's with one of the things that's going on in the recovery in Altadena is I've had a couple of conversations with some of the recovery planners, and I'll ask them like, how are you, have you, especially when these wild ideas come up around, we're just going to turn Altadena, which is not just a historically Black community, but it's known for having just this character and like beauty that people flock to for that. And when they're throwing around ideas around, we're just going to get like a developer and we're going to make it, you all might not know what Irvine is. I mean, most planners do, but they're kind of throwing around ideas that they're just going to make Altadena Irvine. And I'll ask something like, have you talked to anyone about this? Like what's the engagement process? What is that looking like? And they'll respond, well, we run it by our neighborhood council. Like that is the planning mechanism for getting feedback from communities. When you talk to community members, they know that some of the neighborhood councils, particularly some of the ones in Altadena, are known for being very NIMBY. And so they're known to already kind of harbor certain sort of interests that may not be in alignment with how this is going to impact all of the folks. And so I just say that as an example because I think that there are these ways that while when we talk about justice and we talk about these things, it seems like they're floating in the air, but there are some ways that we have to kind of look at the ways that we've set up our activities and our processes to sort of say that, okay, we did engagement, but is that really, who is it asking? Is it representative of all the folks, right? Like, do we know what this subset is? What does it look like when they come to the meetings? There are ways that we can sort of unpack that more deeply. And it doesn't mean that's going to give us an answer to like true justice, but we can do some more work to get us closer to that, I think, than what we tend to want to do, which is just to sort of say like we checked it off the box. And so, and again, that's not to completely say people are evil. There's a lot going on. There's a million different things that are happening in the recovery process and people are getting pressure to do it quickly. But, just to give an example of ways that something that could become more just in a way that's a little bit more tangible than just, the open-ended way that sometimes people feel like we talk about it. So
Santina, that was a perfect example. And thank you. And I may borrow that or just use it or co-opt it from you because I often speak and cite the broader phenomenon that you can have a procedurally just outcome that is distributionally inequitable. And then what's our role, right? Like at where do you find your fit in that? And that's, to me, I don't know, it's just something I struggle with.
I think just because I'm in the process of preparing for my comprehensive exams right now, and I've been
This is perfect.
I've been subjected to having to go back and read Rawls and Bentham and Roy and all of these justice scholars, and the conclusion I'm coming to is that there's no such thing as a positivistic definition of justice. That one of the joys for me of being in planning as a field is that it is not a positivistic field. It is a field where we state our values and then work from there. Because it's multidisciplinary, because our methodologies are not so rigid, and that we have a variety of different methodologies and different people working within it, we get to say, our goal is anti-displacement, and we feel that that's important because it is a justice issue. And then work on, okay, what is important factors for that? What is it important to mean? What aspects do we need to think about when thinking about what displacement is, et cetera? And I think that this is particularly important in the current context where liberalism, the idea of having a plurality of good lives under a banner of commonly agreed upon norms, is directly under attack by our federal administration. That it's all of a sudden a partisan issue to say that you have freedom of choice within, a certain set of institutions and norms to live as you want. Instead, we have a system where the system they're trying to build, I should say, is one where the services that you receive, the protections you get, the freedoms that you have are dependent on what you can provide in support for the administration, what value you have to them. It's transactional. So, I think that holding on to this thin concept of the good, this idea that, there's these commonly agreed upon norms of, maximizing freedom to the extent that it doesn't infringe on other people's ability to do the same, isn't going to be very successful if we don't have another group of people who is playing with the same set of rules. So instead, I think that we need to think hard about what our values are, and state them clearly and fight for those. And it's a scary place to be because it goes against a really strong tradition in American culture. But it's for me, it's what I try to keep in mind is this idea that we're all in this together and that we're more connected than we think. So that helps me to think about a guide of what is right at a particular moment, personally.
Eric, I think that's so well said, and I want to turn it over to the students, but I just want to make the point that I think some people, and I'm not saying this is the right argument, but they would also say, well, that liberalism inherent in pluralism, again, I agree with everything you said there, is, and you're going to pass these comps wonderfully, I can feel it, that the underlying liberalism that's at the foundation discursively of the pluralism is also under attack from sectarian far left as much as it is from the right. Now, I'm not equivocating that argument, but I think that there is an illiberal nature that is inherent in populism that we can understand that crosses conventions of political ideology. And that's the challenge of that's the challenge, I think, I would argue, of the American university going forward is, can we restore a kind of discursiveness that isn't entirely beholden to social norms that are representative of maybe of the majority of the people and their underlying values, but how do we mediate that with a different set of values, even if those are competing values? I don't know, but
maybe we should have universities that explicitly express their values and be able to like
keep people out. I mean, I don't know, because I think that's a little bit of a slippery slope to the extent, I mean, this gets into net neutrality and institutional neutrality considerations, but it's difficult.
I appreciate the deep intellectual conversation. And I mean, we actually grappled with this too just last week in my class in terms of authoritarianism, and like when we have some conception of justice and good, should we force that on people in some kind of way, especially when we know that democracy is really sort of the beauty and key to success. But anywho, let's open it up again to the audience, both online and in person, for any questions with our remaining time. Yeah.
My question that I would have for anyone who wants to answer is, I'm like really interested in like education and how we can intersect like climate and sustainability with like youth. So my question would be like, how do you approach like taking what you've learned from your work and your research and like communicating that, like both to like a general audience, but like specifically to youth, and like how we can use that to like inform like a future generation?
I would argue that citizen science in the evolution of citizen science plays a very important role, and our understanding of the competing ideas of the philosophies of science and developing some literacy allows us to bring some order to our own observations of the nature of change. And so as citizen scientists, we become participants in the state of change in interest of climate or sustainability, whatever that may be. And so I think that it's a kind of empowering function, but I think it's one that it connects us to others along the way from which we can learn.
Santina?
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, so mine's not as much a direct youth example, but just in terms of like the kind of outputs that we produce with a lot of my research groups. So because a lot of, as I mentioned before, a lot of our projects are kind of coming from like what communities want studied. That's not some of the first stuff we ask them when we lay out the projects is sort of what sort of outputs are going to be the most digestible, how they want to be able to receive the information. And so like that tree project that I was mentioning where we were looking at urban forestry and resilience questions in South LA, we basically like produced a lot of like reports. They wanted to do short videos. They had stuff that went on like their TikTok and all this stuff. And so like we worked that into the whole project so that in addition to collecting the data and doing all the academic stuff, they have these sort of more tangible reports and things that actually are written in ways that like communities can actually understand in a way, not that they can't understand the academic piece, but it's not necessarily the same kind of usefulness for them. And so I think that same kind of thing can be channeled for students and youth sort of spaces in the same sort of way. And we found it to be really successful, and they take the reports and stuff to like city council meetings, and they all have different sorts of, directions they go with it. But we always set that up right from the beginning and incorporate it into our research that way.
And Santina, that a lot of that can be data itself, right? Especially in the age of big data, media, more and more of it. I mean, it behooves us to leverage it and incorporate it into more traditional data processes.
And it's more used. That's the other thing too, that like the old school structures of academia don't always respond to, that we get sometimes more traffic from public reports, things that go online than, a journal article that, barely gets any citations. So yeah, that's the other thing about being kind of in the lane of the future, the youth know.
Bing, I saw you unmute. Did you want to chime in on this question?
Oh, very quickly. So at a university setting, just give you one example. I teach a course, particularly just on carbon neutral development. That is an interdisciplinary course open to real estate students, science and engineering and arts ladder, right? So for me to actually create interdisciplinary learning environment is key to youth education. The idea is we should never have those students, a younger generation, go into the discipline silos so quickly. We have to provide a broader base. And in terms of engaging even younger one, K to 12 students, I think is through different type of program, like a summer program, and having the student actually working with the research team. Not necessarily with us, faculties, and actually working with a little older kids, right? The undergraduate students, even graduate students. I think this type of a tier learning and multi-level learning is especially important because they learn more among the peers instead of learning from the instructor and faculty.
No, that's great, man. Yeah, Kate.
Hi, my name is Kate. This is a question for anybody, though I might call Santina out as someone who's also in California, because I'm from Northern California. And so I have some experience with like fire season, or we would call it nosebleed season because the air would get so dry and smoky. And in this class, we've talked about how sustainability takes a lot of forms, not just environmental, but I would like to focus in this question on environmental sustainability. How is it that you guys approach your work or your research when in environmental sustainability as something that has like seasons, like hurricane season and fire season? How does that change your guys' approach?
Oh, I can answer this really quickly, actually, by a counter. Like I said, hello, California neighbor. We actually don't use season anymore for fires. Fortunately, I guess fortunately for the language, unfortunately for our, planning and livelihoods, because like for what you're seeing right now, we get wildfires all year round. So that's actually been something that I guess just to sort of speak to sort of like the ever evolvingness of these spaces and being an environmental planner. You're totally right. This is something that, like when I was growing up as a kid, like we literally had a whole time of the year that was fire season. And now it's so unpredictable that we get them all the time. And so the thing I would just say, I think more that the way that I kind of come to this in my research is something that I'm really big on. I have a couple of projects that are looking at this, is really the idea of pushing the importance of thinking about intersectionally about hazards and risks. And I think this sort of timing dimension is part of it, because one of the things, as you probably know, California has, we're not the only place, but we have, a laundry list of risks at our disposal. There's really not a place that you can go to that you're not exposed to something, right? So it's not fires, it's, earthquakes, it's flooding. There's a lot of places that have multiple at the same time. And so I think I would encourage, that's always what I'm trying to talk to people about, is trying to get comfortable in this kind of messy space, that there's different timing to things. They all kind of happen at lots of different times. And I think what we know from a disaster planning perspective is there are some things that are unique to each one, but a lot of things, the ways that communities behave and the way that things that we have to anticipate, doing good engagement, it's pretty consistent across the board. And so trying to not get so stuck in terms of the silos of that it needs to be just this risk or at just this time, and being more open to sort of the way that these things are kind of evolving, because that's just what we're seeing because of climate impacts across the board. And I'm sure other people have other experiences based on their areas of work as well.
Yeah, no, Santina, multi-hazard context cascading events. I mean, I think it's a global phenomenon. A lot of what we're seeing, we can't talk about it in just one traditional silo because, again, a lot of things are happening simultaneously.
And when you add in vulnerabilities, makes it even worse, right? So then people's vulnerabilities stack on top of that. So totally agree.
Fair.
Thank you very much for everything that you have contributed to this dialogue. It's been phenomenally rich food for thought. I want to ask two questions, and you can selectively decide which question to respond to. One refers to one of the topics that you had in the title for the dialogue that you haven't referred explicitly to, you have touched implicitly about it, and it is about trauma. And you know that in the health sciences and in public health, there are long traditions of trauma-informed practices, but we don't have that, unfortunately, yet in planning and in the special disciplines in general. But we're seeing a lot of trauma related to disasters and climate change in general. So how are you encountering that in your practice, in your research, and how do you feel we are unprepared or prepared to recognize it, deal with it, or what should we do about preparing better, if at all? And related to that, on education, which is also in the description of the dialogue, what should we do differently or better with regards to educating the new generations of professionals in the special disciplines facing these new realities and challenges?
I'll jump in quick on trauma if I can. So it makes me think of a number of different lines of literature in community resilience that have been drawn out of public health. As I referenced earlier, there's actually a great unit at UCLA actually that has taken on mental health, counseling, and tried to understand also the implications. And I think, in our work, or the work that I read in, there's a lot of really interesting research going on about the extent to which not just the shocks, but the chronic stresses shape underlying mental health and the extent to which that becomes an underlying pathology, one for other uh, uh, physical pathologies and illnesses and a detriment to our broader health, human health, not just mental health, but that interaction, but also, well, what do you do about it, right? Like, what are the normative practice-centered ways that we think about a holistic orientation to physical and mental well-being. And, in medicine, there is, emergency room doctors obviously are trained in trauma and mental trauma, and that because when someone's going in shock, right, there's this interaction that's happening there. But I think increasingly among primary care physicians and in family medicine, they're beginning to understand how to interview, how to diagnose, like there's a diagnostic dimension here. In fact, interestingly enough, I wrote the definition for the National Climate Assessment associated with, oh my gosh, my brain is melting all of a sudden. It was it was climate anxiety, but ultimately the American Psychiatric Association labeled it environmental anxiety. But there's a formal diagnostic code, right? So I think we've moved to the point in the health sciences where we can diagnose these dimensions of not just the shock of displacement and those associations, but also the underlying chronic conditions. And I think that's a step, certainly one could argue a step in the right direction. In acknowledging and diagnosing and treating this as an underlying pathology as we would in any other context.
Yeah, no, Jesse, that's great. And too, just if I might leverage my privilege as moderator to say that in some of our work in Baltimore, with folks who are experiencing basement backup, basement flooding, sanitary sewer overflows, we in the pilot work ask questions related to mental health and trauma, especially just the fear of repetitive losses, and how even at the sound of thunder or rain, it induces a level of anxiety to where people rush home to tend to the potential risk of flooding and explosion. So it's a very real thing. And I think as planners, if we haven't thought about it in the past, we definitely ought to be thinking about it and baking it into the practice and the research that we do.
Yeah, and I can just add a little bit to that. Yeah, I think it hasn't, I completely appreciate the question because I do think that it's been something that's kind of been missing from sort of the main canon of conversation in planning. Similar to what Marcus described, we do that as well in some of our projects. And so I had done actually a wildfire study a couple years ago in kind of a more rural part of California where we worked with kids that had lost their homes after a wildfire event. And yeah, even if you don't ask, I was just going to add, even if you don't ask about trauma related things, as you're analyzing, you can see these themes coming up, right? And so exactly like what Marcus described, right? You have kids that, years later are still sort of like living with, go bags around their door because they remember and they're nervous of what had happened before. And so when those things aren't, well kind of incorporated into sort of how we address the issue, the broader scale of recovery issues, those things stick. And especially, and I think it kind of connects to Clara, to your second point about, what this means for the future and youth and sort of how we kind of move forward, because when you're sort of seeing those long-term effects, and so, we did this study 2 years ago, but we just wrote a piece in the conversation about the same sort of thing is happening in terms of what the kids are seeing in the wildfires in LA, right? And so you see it pretty consistently every time. I guess just to try to leave it on a little bit of a more positive note, the question about the students and the hope and part, the funny part is I've been working on this personally very deeply, like from my students, because I noticed this a few years ago that, again, I'm pretty comfortable and just like, the world is ending and it is what it is, like that's just sort of like the vantage point that so much of my work lives in. And I had, some students be like, well, we want some hope. We want to think about, they kind of encouraged me to really think about how can we pull in hope and optimism into it. And so that, kind of pushed me to add some more modules to my courses that had, more literature on climate optimism and how we can be thinking about that. And so I think I really appreciate that, that the youth are really pushing us to sort of think about how we can more actively think about those things. And I think I guess my most positive piece of it is that after having kind of a couple years of having this dialogue with my students in the last semester, they were all sort of like, actually, I think being able to kind of have the power of the knowledge of what's happening around disasters and understanding how to actually plan for these things, they kind of said to me in the reviews at the end that actually made them feel more optimistic about what they were going to be doing in the future now that they had this toolkit. So I think hopefully the kind of conversations that we're having and the conversations that we're instilling in our students can sort of not feel devastating, but can kind of make it feel like you can kind of play an important role in what comes in the future. So that's the closest I can get to optimistic. I'm still working on getting farther than that.
Right. No, thank you, Santina. That's great. And I think we're all sort of under construction when it comes to sort of pursuing that optimism. And so we're right at time.
Yes.
Really appreciate the conversation. A round of applause again for
Let me end by inviting everybody to our fourth and last dialogue in this series. It would be great to have the speakers in there. It would be on disrupting slow violence, untapping the healing power of the special disciplines, and it will be on April 16th, 11 to 12:30 Eastern Daytime. So thank you very much. It will be hybrid again. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your presence and all of your contributions. And knowledge is power, and it is optimism and hope too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.